August 11, 2026. Right now, rescue teams across western Colombia are digging through the rubble of collapsed apartment buildings, a hospital's pediatric ward, and a regional airport terminal, racing against time to find survivors after the strongest earthquake to hit the country in a decade. A magnitude 7.4 earthquake tore through the Chocó region on Monday morning, and as of the latest update, at least 132 people are confirmed dead, 570 injured, and the death toll is still climbing. 5 of Colombia's capital cities are under a red alert. 86 buildings have collapsed, 7 airports have suspended operations, and in the city of Cali alone, nearly 200 people remain missing. So let's break down exactly what happened, why this specific earthquake turned out to be so much more destructive than a typical quake of this magnitude, and what comes next for the communities now living through the early, chaotic hours of disaster response. Drop a comment right now. If you're anywhere in Colombia, Ecuador, Panama, or Venezuela and felt this earthquake yourself, tell me what that moment was actually like. And if you want updates as this death toll and rescue effort continues to develop, subscribe to the channel and hit that bell icon, because these numbers are almost certainly going to keep changing over the next several days. The earthquake struck at 7:34 in the morning local time on Monday, August 10th, with its epicenter located near the town of San Jose del Palmar in Colombia's Chocó department, a remote, underdeveloped stretch of western Colombia, sitting somewhere between 150 and 250 miles west of the capital, Bogotá, depending on which measurement point you reference. The United States Geological Survey put the quake's depth at 107 kilometers, roughly 66 miles, while Colombia's own geological survey measured it slightly shallower, at 96 kilometers. Both agencies agreed on the magnitude, 7.4, and both attributed the rupture to strike-slip faulting at that intermediate depth, meaning the ground on either side of the fault moved horizontally past itself, rather than one side thrusting up and over the other, along what scientists believe was either a northeast trending left lateral fault or a northwest trending right lateral fault deep beneath the region. According to Colombia's Geological Service, this was the most powerful tremor to hit the country this century, and separate reporting from the Associated Press described it as the largest earthquake to impact Colombia in a decade. The shaking itself was felt across an extraordinary geographic range. Approximately 10.5 million people experienced strong to very strong shaking, according to USGS estimates, and the quake was felt not just across Colombia's major cities, but into neighboring Ecuador, Panama, and even Venezuela. In Bogotá, sitting well over 100 miles from the epicenter, residents evacuated buildings and gathered in the streets as the ground moved beneath the capital. A 29-year-old content creator in Bogotá, Valeria Polo, described the shaking to the Agence France-Presse news agency simply as very, very strong. Bogotá's mayor, Carlos Fernando Galán, said some buildings in the capital had cracked, though there were no reports there of severe structural damage, a genuinely fortunate outcome given how far the capital sits from where the earthquake's most violent energy was actually concentrated. That energy landed instead on the cities and towns of western Colombia, far closer to the rupture itself, and the damage there has been devastating. In Pereira, one of the hardest-hit cities, the mayor, Mauricio Salazar, told local radio that at least 18 people had died in the city alone, with many more trapped beneath what he described as a massive quantity of collapsed buildings. Video from Pereira's airport captured pieces of ceiling crashing down on travelers who had taken shelter inside, people screaming and running through rubble in a scene of genuine panic as the terminal shook around them. By the most recent update, Pereira's death toll alone had climbed to 60, according to Colombia's Association of Capital Cities, the single highest concentration of fatalities from any city affected by the quake. In Manizales, another major city in the region, the mayor reported that 17 buildings had collapsed entirely, with an additional 19 partially collapsed. In Cali, Colombia's third-largest city, rescue teams and ordinary residents worked side by side picking through the remains of destroyed structures, including, in a detail that's genuinely difficult to process, the pediatric and neonatal sections of a local hospital, which collapsed during the shaking. Cali's mayor confirmed that at least 188 people remained missing in the city as of Monday evening. Footage shared on social media captured the moment the earthquake struck, showing the facade of a church partially collapsing in real time as the ground shook beneath it. The scale of structural damage across the broader region is staggering, even before accounting for the full human toll. Colombia's newly inaugurated president, Abelardo de la Espriella, said that more than 1,600 buildings had been damaged by the quake, and he formally declared a national disaster to allow for the mobilization and coordination of emergency response efforts across the affected departments. Colombia's Association of Capital Cities later reported that 86 buildings had collapsed entirely nationwide, that 5 separate capital cities were under a red alert designation, and that 7 airports across the country had been forced to suspend operations, either due to direct structural damage or as a precaution while runways and terminals were inspected for safety. In Quibdó, the capital of Choco department itself, and home to roughly 140,000 people, the region's governor reported multiple injuries and severe damage to buildings, with local television footage showing collapsed structures and significant damage to the regional airport there as well. At least 21 separate aftershocks followed within hours of the main shock, including one measuring magnitude 5.0, a genuinely significant secondary earthquake in its own right, that would be capable of causing additional damage to buildings already weakened by the initial rupture. That pattern of aftershock activity is exactly why search and rescue teams working through partially collapsed structures right now are operating under such difficult, dangerous conditions. Since a building that survived the main shock in a compromised state can potentially fail entirely during a strong enough aftershock, putting both trapped survivors and the rescuers trying to reach them at continued risk. To understand why this specific earthquake proved so destructive despite striking at a depth that would normally help dampen surface shaking, it's worth understanding the broader tectonic setting Colombia sits within. Colombia sits at the convergence of three major tectonic plates: the Nazca Plate, the Caribbean Plate, and the South American Plate, an unusually complex junction that makes this entire region one of the most seismically active in South America. Unlike many major earthquakes, which occur at relatively shallow depths where nearly all of the seismic energy hits the surface directly, Monday's quake struck at an intermediate depth of roughly 60 to 66 miles beneath the surface. Normally, an earthquake at that kind of depth would be expected to produce somewhat less violent shaking at the surface than a shallow earthquake of the same magnitude, since more of the seismic energy gets absorbed by the rock layers between the rupture and the surface along the way. But a magnitude 7.4 earthquake releases an enormous amount of energy regardless of depth, and when that much energy radiates outward from an intermediate depth rupture, it can still produce genuinely severe shaking across an extraordinarily wide geographic footprint, which is exactly what explains both the 10.5 million people who experienced strong shaking and the fact that this quake was felt as far away as Venezuela, Ecuador, and Panama. The building damage concentrated so heavily in cities like Pereira, Manizales, and Cali also reflects a pattern seen repeatedly in earthquakes striking Latin American cities that weren't uniformly built to the strictest modern seismic codes. A combination of older construction, inconsistent enforcement of building standards in some neighborhoods, and simple bad luck in terms of which specific structures happen to sit closest to where the earthquake's energy concentrated most intensely. It's worth noting this isn't Colombia's first experience with a genuinely catastrophic earthquake. Back in 1999, a magnitude 6.2 earthquake struck the city of Armenia in Colombia's coffee-growing region, killing close to 1,900 people and remaining one of the deadliest natural disasters in the country's modern history. A sobering reminder that even a considerably smaller earthquake than Monday's can prove devastating when it strikes densely populated areas with vulnerable building stock. There's also a genuinely difficult regional context worth acknowledging here, because this earthquake didn't strike a part of the world that was otherwise having a quiet year. Colombia's disaster comes less than 2 months after 2 devastating earthquakes struck neighboring Venezuela back in late June, a sequence that caused major destruction and mass casualties in that country, with international medical relief organizations like Direct Relief still actively working to support Venezuela's healthcare system in the aftermath, even as they now begin mobilizing resources for Colombia as well. Major earthquakes measuring 7.0 or higher are known to cause severe, cascading impacts to regional healthcare systems specifically, since hospitals themselves are frequently among the buildings damaged or destroyed, exactly the pattern already confirmed in Cali, where the pediatric and neonatal sections of a local hospital collapsed during the quake, stripping the region of critical medical capacity at precisely the moment it's needed most. Given everything unfolding right now, here's the honest picture of where things stand. This is an active, rapidly evolving disaster, with confirmed fatalities already exceeding 130 and climbing, hundreds more injured, and nearly 200 people still unaccounted for in Cali alone. Rescue operations are ongoing across multiple cities simultaneously, complicated by continued aftershock activity, damaged infrastructure including multiple suspended airports, and the sheer scale of the more than 1,600 buildings reported damaged nationwide. President de la Espriela's declaration of a national disaster has opened the door for expanded federal resources and international assistance, and organizations like Direct Relief are already mobilizing medical aid to support the country's strained healthcare system. If you have family or connections in the affected region, official updates from Colombia's Association of Capital Cities and the national government remain the most reliable source of current information, as this situation continues to develop rapidly hour by hour. If you're anywhere in the broader region still feeling aftershocks, standard earthquake safety guidance applies. Move away from windows and unstable structures. Know where you'd shelter if shaking begins again, and treat any building with visible cracking or structural damage as unsafe to re-enter until it's been formally inspected, given how many structures across this region are now compromised, even if they didn't collapse outright during Monday's main shock. We'll keep tracking this story closely as it develops. Updates to the death toll and missing persons count, the search and rescue effort still actively underway in Pereira, Cali, and Manizales, and the broader international relief response as it ramps up. Subscribe and hit that bell icon so you don't miss those updates, because this death toll is very likely still going to rise in the coming days. And drop that comment below if you haven't yet, wherever you're watching from. See you in the next one.